Hello and welcome to another War Report Extra. This is a bit of a special edition because you'll be probably watching this on 4th of July morning. That's when I'll have it set to premiere. And I figured no more appropriate date than to zoom out and take a look at the state of America, American identity, and really just unpacking what's been happening over the past, month and a week so far, past 5, 6 weeks. And I just want to start out by just giving you a broad picture. Now, I believe it was Moldbug who said this, that the United States is on its fourth regime, as it were. The first were the Articles of Confederation, which were illegally abolished by the constitutional regime, which was illegally abolished by the Unionist regime after the Civil War, which that was abolished by the New Deal regime that's been in place since FDR, since World War II. You could argue 1965 was a new one, but I would say this most recent paradigm is yet another overthrow of the regime in America. It is another retooling of what America is as a country, as a nation, as an empire, over, of course, not just this one instant of an interaction with a police officer and a black man who had death. Now, that's the initial instant, but again, I'll get into it later. But that's the one thing that set off all these things that were brewing under the surface. So, as you all know, George Floyd encounters a police officer, gets killed. Now, again, I'm not even going to get into the debate of whether there was excessive police force or whether he was a criminal who had it coming, because at the end of the day, that is all irrelevant to this discussion, especially at this point, 1 month on, completely irrelevant, and you're just getting bogged down in semantics. You're getting bogged down in the argument they want you to get bogged down when you debate police chokeholds or over policing of black neighborhoods or police brutality, because, again, that is all what they want you to talk about. That is the distraction issue. That is the popcorn. That's what they throw to you so you shut up about what's actually going on. And of course, all of that led to the protests and riots which we have seen over the past, again, 5, 6 weeks now. And that all culminates with the pulling down of the statues, the demanding, taking down different monuments, renaming things, going after the founding fathers. It started with the Confederate generals. Again, this argument's been going on since before the debacle in Charlottesville. I'll leave it at that. But you have all of these things coming together, and then this one police incident, which, again, if it was not that, if the media didn't pick up on that, they would have picked up on something. Some police encounter with a black man, some police encounter with a white cop and a black man that ends with the black man's death, regardless of the circumstance. They were just waiting for the right one to pounce on. They found their right one, which initiated this. Because, again, we saw this to a much lesser degree and much lesser goals in 2015, 2016, before the election, to drum up Democratic support. Now, I have no doubt that this is part of this current crisis, but this is not the only thing. Whereas in 2015, 2016, it was arguable that, oh yeah, it's just a DNC trap. Then you can go and how to all the Black Lives Matter donation links lead back to the DNC donation page. But my point being is, regardless of what it was, what happened, they were looking for an instant to kick off what they really wanted to do, what they really wanted to implement after the destabilization Trump caused, after the destabilization 2016 election caused, and everything following that, and all the stuff before that. But what I'm getting at is this is a culmination of the politics, I would say, since the 2000s, the direction things have been going, in one instant, which has led to whatever the hell is going on now, which we're going to unpack over the, I don't know, about this next hour here.
Yeah, you could also say that the first kind of uptick to this was the Occupy Wall Street movement. Then I would say the Trayvon Martin, the Brown, and Ferguson. All of them. These are all sort of parts. Let's not also forget the BLM protest in Dallas that caused the death of five policemen, and then I believe a week later, three more in a different southern state that escapes me right now. I don't know whether that was Mississippi or Louisiana,
I think it was Georgia, but
but
point being,
yeah, yeah, we're and so you have this culmination coming after COVID of all these desperate parts, sort of in one large movement that is really held together by the anti-Trump, resistance movement. Trump is killing us with COVID. Trump is a dictator. The whole nonsense of
Yeah,
it all.
black trans women and the black trans victims of violence, or whatever niche thing they tried to squeeze in there, or Antifa talking about the evils and dangers of capitalism, putting it all under one banner of the American left, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, yeah. I will. Yeah, there it does seem, at least for now, some kind of unification of all these desperate parts of the left that hadn't happened before. And really, yeah, so everything like from Bernie Bros to BLM activists, and whatever latest gripe that Antifa has and so on.
Yeah, but of course, the reason the left has changed and that we're truly in the era of the new left is even back in the day they could have convinced the labor unions to get involved in some way, shape, or form. Whereas, again, I'm sure all their spokespeople, I'm sure all their PR outlets have put out statements saying, "Oh, we condemn racism" or whatever. But again, you don't see general strikes of workers going on right now, which I think is pretty telling of just sort of the shift in American culture and American politics. The fact that yeah, under any other circumstances, or even left wing activism in the tumultuous times of the 20s and 30s would have had worker strikes, and we have yet to see that. And another big factor that plays into this, you mentioned COVID, not only the outbreak of the disease, but the economic fallout from it. A lot of people are not
Hmm.
working right now. A lot of people are uh, in financial dire straits and are more likely to take more drastic and stupid actions, especially the ones who aren't employed, because again, they can go to these protests, they can go to whatever, and I'm sure, as you've all seen, the media playing it up. Don't go to any parties, don't go to any gatherings, shut down churches, shut down whatever. But protesting
Yeah.
is of the utmost importance right now. You just and oh, don't wear your masks. Don't keep 6 feet apart. I'm sure you've seen the crowds of people. Like they'll show a few with masks, but you go to like the roughly live streams of the people actually broadcasting what's happening on the ground. It looks like they would any other time. And these are the people who finger wag about those boomers who did the open carry demonstrations, all five of them wearing their masks. They're the real problem. They're the ones who are going to shut this down. Or they try to blame the reopening of bars and restaurants when, again, it isn't the masses and the crowds of people flooding into the street affecting this. Nay, it is those dirty,
I actually
evil
saw a
white
CNN article
Republicans.
today. I actually saw a CNN article today that boasted, get this, that protests might have even curbed, yes, curbed the rise of COVID-19. I kid you, I kid you not, I kid you not,
I have
I
to
kid
say at
you
this
not.
point, I think
Like literally an hour ago.
I think we've lost almost in all of, if not entirely all of, our rights to make fun of third world media, the propaganda that comes out of North Korea, China, Iran, because we've reached the same level of absurdity. Just the fact that these aren't state owned media outlets, they're just state controlled media outlets, they're private corporations. Because at this point, it's as absurd as that. Now, again, at least not yet. They won't break down our doors and throw us away for saying this, but in terms of the rhetoric that they're putting out, it's, I would say at this point, equally as absurd. With something like that, like, oh, it's decreasing protests. The protests are decreasing the spread of the virus because you know what, the virus it gets scared when you have it racism, anti-racism demonstration, because Trump made it a racial issue when he called it the China virus or the China flu. See, I'm putting these things together. I'm doing the work that the media will not, and I'm really carrying the load for them. So they should be thankful, if anything.
Yeah. Next headline: Chaz actually reduced the amount of violence in Seattle.
Chaz has the lowest amount of COVID-19 cases of any country, believe it or not.
Yeah, so they're going to come up with these narratives, and they're going to stick to them. And even this will even be rehashed. There'll be the odd article where I'm very sure they'll defend Chaz for one reason or another. When everybody knew it was like far from being a communist commune, bringing up workers' rights, it was really just a bunch of, honestly, like anarchist hippie dippies, like that did not come across to me like union members that are fighting for American workers. Of course, we all know that that has disappeared from the left for decades now.
Wait, are you
But
telling me
there's
Ras Simone was not a hero of the working class?
he was of the warlord class.
I'm just out of if I had to say I respected any of them, the one I would say I hate least was probably Raz, just because of
Same.
how absurdly hilarious it is. And you know what? I saw the take, and you're probably gonna like this. Raz Simone was the Joseph Stalin of Chaz.
He had swag, like
Yeah, yeah. We the police now. Okay, I can give a. I mean, yeah. Has there been any point where an anarchist movement hasn't been gay? I can't think of one.
yeah, yeah. I mean, truly, truly, all of them. But there's a
I'm
lot of
gay and I hate
important
my
questions
father. I'm an
now.
anarchist.
I think one of the things that's developed, or one of the questions that this has brought up, of course, because it's an election year, is especially for the dissident right about Trump or Biden. For some people, that's going to be very easy to answer. For others, it doesn't even matter anymore. What I find interesting is the messaging behind it. There is a subtle messaging taking place that if Biden is elected, and even Moldbug has come out and said this, that it will mean less acceleration and generally a calmer America. But one could ask why. Well, all we have to do is kind of look at the Bundy Ranch and what happened after the Bundy Ranch a year later. Almost everybody's forgotten that fiasco, right? Obama came down. I think one or two of these guys was killed. Uh, Nobody remembers it. Everybody felt that Obama was acting within the law, and there was no way that Trump could have ever acted that way. So, despite that, a lot of people blame Trump or blame Trump for listening to Kushner. The truth is Kushner may not have been wrong, and Kushner may have had word, from the generals, from Milley, from Mattis, from even what's his name,
Esper.
yes. So, I mean, I saw a document which had like over 8 or 9 of these generals sign on about not outright saying to prevent Trump from bringing in the National Guard, but that it wasn't necessary and that it wouldn't stand with him. This was a soft coup moment. This was the moment of America's soft color revolution. America just had a color revolution. That is what has taken place. And just like other color revolutions around the world, very wealthy NGOs working in tandem with the CIA have made this possible. So, and in a way, that too is a signal for the rest of the world to say that Trump is going to leave and America is going to be back in business. You can trust us again afterwards. However, I think that moment is past. In the same way that Biden is not going to restore order, and faith in America geopolitically will not return. The one and the second are both related, and as I just want to mention, finish up where I started earlier, about why is it possible that Biden can introduce peace? Well, in the same way that you saw during a Democratic presidency, these things, if they arise again, whether they're left wing or right wing, but primarily if it's an issue for the left wing, they can be quickly forgotten. And if it's an issue that's around race, it'll get a certain amount of coverage. There's no telling what will happen.
Yeah, look no further than Ferguson and Obama's response to that. They had that shut down very quickly. There were the protests, there were the riots, there was the typical media squawking about race relations in America, but it was over and done with within a few days.
Yeah, excellent. And then you're right. And there were 2 shootings, and one was a cop. But again, uh, it did it did get suppressed really quickly. Obama didn't get a lot of criticism for that. Certainly no criticism from the left that I can remember. Definitely not from the mainstream media. So that's what we would see, and that's what is promised by this calm that would come about if Biden became president. And that's the same signal, basically, for America's geopolitical standing with regards to its allies. So I think that's what we're seeing, because primarily this is a resist Blumph movement. One can well imagine if Trump got elected, that the stakes would even go higher. And in this sense, Trump is the greater accelerationist. Both would be accelerationists because they're both such poor candidates to lead America. But without question, I think I would side with Trump being the greater accelerationist candidate.
Oh yeah, definitely. If you want chaos candidate, if you want the elites to have a headache, I think Trump would be the better option as well. And I'm gonna say, with what you brought up about Obama and Ferguson and the Bundy Ranch, I do think Trump's instinct when this first happened was send the National Guard in, send the military in, send the riot police in, and shut it down. But I think this was one of his cases where it isn't that he just didn't try hard enough, but there was no political capital at all to do anything like that. He was not in a position to do anything like that, and it would have blown up in his face. And it's not often I'll make that sort of defense of Trump, because there's a lot of people who still want to think that there's something that can be salvaged out of Trump. They'll say those sort of things, but honestly, I do think this is one of the few cases where his hands were genuinely tied. And yeah, going back to the accelerationist point in the Biden return to normal sort of thing, I do think that Trump, in the long term, can probably play this off in a certain way because, again, his electoral chances are probably the rockiest they've been since he's been in office. And I would say it's not clear who's going to win because a lot of people are saying, well, Biden got in the bag. Trump has completely made a fool of himself and shown himself to be incompetent and impotent. I wouldn't go that far. I still think it's a toss up nationwide. But one thing Trump can do, and I've touched on this before, is he can play this like this is a deep state coup against me. This is what the deep state. This is what the Democrats, and this is what the uh, fake news media is saying about me. And I don't know when he can start having rallies again with the corona outbreak or any of that, but in terms of what he says on Twitter, what he says in interviews, he can really play this off. Now, again, it will be a kicking the can down the road sort of thing when it comes to actually addressing these problems, but he can say, this is a plot against me, and really rally a lot of the same more distant elements, people who already had distrust these institutions behind him, even if it's just enough to get them to check his name at the ballot box, which again is all you need. Now, whether a second term Trump would actually solve this is again a question in and of itself that we'll probably end up getting into. But point being is he can play this to his advantage if he's smart. And honestly, I think Kushner will probably have his ear on it because look, I doubt Kushner. I'm not implying he's on his side or anything, but he definitely wants Trump to get reelected, even just for the sake of his own career. But my point is that Trump can very easily turn it on its head, at least to a degree, at least enough to help him in the polls and in the ballot box.
Right. If he plays, for lack of a better term that can come to my mind at the moment, the martyr card, and he's done it before. If he can do that, then yes, he can get reelected. Now we're just talking short term, but long term, what does this mean for Americans, especially for Americans of European descent, is tragic, and it's given the last 4 weeks, absolutely downright scary. So it isn't going to change that necessarily. It might speed some things along because if he is reelected, this resistance movement will go on, and it will really play the hand, I think, of many, many controlling powers in the U.S. You might even have a fracturing in the CIA as to what to do about that, or the FBI, or or the DOJ. Like, you can well imagine how fracturing this will be, because it could get to the point where it's even bigger than Trump, or the only solution is Trump literally has to be run out of the White House, elections be damned. Now, I personally don't believe he is going to be reelected. I could be wrong. I was wrong the first time. But what I fear is, presently, is that with all the talk of, the second wave, like it's amazing how the second wave came after a month, and it coincided, yes, with some places opening up, but also with the protests. Um, it's amazing to me that there seems to be still very little policing. There are several cities that have, on average, between 50 to 100 people. And you have incidents like the one in Utah of the guy shooting a 60-year-old man driving in a SUV that was blocked by protesters, like in small town, in relatively small towns in Utah, of all places, right? So there's a stretching, if you will, of this movement. And what I'm most afraid of is like what if there's going to be a white guy and he's going to have had enough of this. And I don't know what they're going to do. And that will be the vilifying moment. That will be the moment that BLM will be justified and the order of events will be reversed. It will be um, right wing shooter was started the whole thing, even though it's the reverse of that. And so you'll have uh, probably a new batch of protests, but it will give white people in America basically very little leverage. If there's anything like another synagogue shooting
Yeah, it takes one
or African
guy egged
American
on by
church,
the feds. That's all it takes.
right, right. And so that's all it will take. And the stakes are much greater than they were, back with, Dylan Roof or, uh, 2018, the synagogue shooting in Pennsylvania, right? Like, first of all, nobody counts when, like, say, police officers are killed with people who are in some ways connected with BLM, or I mean, I don't mean just now. I mean back in 2016. Nobody's going to count those. Nobody's going to care. I mean, do you see the mainstream media actually talking about Chaz? I mean, there were 6 shootings. 3 people, I believe, are in hospital. 2 are dead. Both of the dead are under 20. One 16, the other one 19. And there is no outcry because, of course, I mean, we're seeing this violence because we're seeing the demographic shift. That's all these groups are basically looking, and like most minority groups, I would say that their focus is extremely narrow. They're not tied to this country in the same way, even if they have no other home than here. And what I
And
mean by that
just to
is
just to
they have, go
just
ahead.
just to further that point, you even see this where their view is so narrow that you think they get the coalition of the minorities. We us black and brown people lock hands, but some of the most aggressive fighting you've seen so far, it's been between blacks and Hispanics.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. But they've had a lot of Karens on the side of the BLM, which was expected. There's other groups that have formed with them a block of support. 46% of the BLM protesters are white, so that's a huge number. So at the moment, yes, they do have their support. However, I would argue um, that minorities, historically speaking, have very single issue focus about where the country should go. It's generally their group that they're concerned about the most, and every single issue that comes along will be about whether this is good for their people or not. Many of them still have homes, well, kind of homes that they could return to, or a land where they could blend in. Um,
Including
and
yours
this
truly,
goes,
but I digress.
yeah, right. So and this goes to the question of, with the statues being torn down, with all of this happening the last 4 weeks, what is the American identity? Well, I would argue minorities don't need an American identity; that they already have their own minority identities, and they are locked in to the identity of America as a place where you shop and live and hopefully pay taxes. That's basically it. So they're not really working. on a new identity. They have their one or two issues that concern their group, and that's it. The real loss of identity is for people of European heritage, whether they were the founding stock from the 17th century or whether they just arrived here in the last 20, 30 years.
Absolutely. And since you brought up the question of American identity, where I think what we're seeing right now is the final death of the WASP American culture, which they had long since lost their domination over American political, cultural, and social issues because, and that happened in the 60s. We all know the story there, but of course they were the foundational stock of this country. All the founding fathers, but I think two, came from the British Isles, were either English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, whatever, from that part of the world. There were some Dutchmen, but again, the point stands. Founding stock, mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and they controlled the country virtually uncontested up until 1965. Now, under that time, of course, you get more the Catholic Irish, the Italians, the Germans, the Eastern Europeans coming in from any time between the 19th century and early 20th century. And
Mm.
it's a workable arrangement. These groups assimilate. They hell even in some cases change their names. Probably the most successful case of this was the mass assimilation campaign upon the American entry into World War One, with a lot of the German communities in uh, the Great Plains and the Midwest, and even out further west. But you had that system; it worked. Everyone anglicized. Yeah, they still had their culture, they still had their heritage, they still had their identity, but it was subordinated to the American identity, the broad WASP Anglo-Saxon culture. And then
Mhm.
along comes World War II, which propels America into its imperial status, which then, of course, creates the narrative that America is on top of the world because it beat the white supremacist Nazis, and that's the narrative they painted post war, which again culminated in the 60s with all the social and political upheaval then, which also coincided with the pretty much opening of the floodgates when it comes to immigration, to the point where WASP identity becomes less relevant and becomes more of a white versus non-white, at the time black. Now, as time has gone on, Hispanic population has increased, where again the black racial grievances, all of those, and then you get into the 80s, get into the 90s. The 90s was viewed as this time of harmony where everyone would lock arms, get along together, not only in this country, but the spread of globalism, the fall of communism. We can all be one united world. Of course, all the globalization propaganda. The 2000s was relatively peaceful, and then again, late 2000s into 2010 set off this powder keg of racial tensions to the point where we are today. And again, I think what we're realizing, especially with the attack on the Confederate statues and a lot of the monuments of just white men from the 19th century, 19th, 20th century, is it's a you're not allowed to even be in a significant position of social power anymore. They're far from dominant, but you're not allowed to have any social power anymore. And we're going to tear down these monuments and put up some black Latinx whatever name Navy ships after Harvey Milk, which is I mean he's a white guy, but apparently being a gay white guy is enough to get you past. And of course, which this hits to me very nearly and dearly, causes me pain, the attacks on Christopher Columbus and the other Italian explorers. Of course, they, particular Columbus, they've been going after hard, tearing down his statues. The one they actually tore down in the city for his namesake, Columbus, was a gift from the city of Genoa, Italy.
Mm. Yeah. And this question has been brought up about, you know, let's say comparing the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s. And the argument is that those people knew what they were doing, what statues they were bringing down, and that the American identity in itself is too young. And these statues that are going down, not only in America, but let's say as well in France and Britain and Belgium and so on. Uh, a Bonaparte statue just went down in France today.
And unfortunately, I
Now,
don't think it was any reactionaries or loyalists to the Bourbon dynasty. So,
that's right.
we have to deal with that.
That's right. They were not supporters of the Sun King dynasty. So, um, So I think in many ways, I mean, you could argue that the Americanization of Europe has also kind of robbed it of its history. You could argue that, right? That everyone in the West is kind of like an American, or is always trying to outdo the American, to become a better American. Canadians do this, that critique of the blue empire, the Democrat empire on the global level, where, these countries will argue about how America could be better and how they're actually an example of how America could be better. I think that's a legitimate argument that the Americanization of Europe has robbed it of its history. It
But
has
look at
given
the
much of its
look at the people
skill
saying that.
complexes.
That most of the people saying that are the primary beneficiaries of the American Empire and these hyper liberals living in London, Paris, wherever. So
Yeah, of course.
I think actually Moldbug, to go back to that again, touched on this where the biggest anti-Americans, at least the people who purport to be, turn out to end up being the biggest supporters of the American Empire. So it's a very weird
Yeah,
paradox.
it is. It is because of the way the paradoxical relationship of power within the U.S. between left and right. But so I think that argument can be made. Um, because I don't really know another argument that it can explain like why it is that I mean I can let me put it to you this way. I can understand the argument that statues in the US are being brought down because they've become meaningless anyways. Or there's enough of the population that finds them meaningless that the tide to tear them down is no longer stoppable, right? Now, I understand there's coercion and intimidation involved, and some of them are just spontaneously brought down. And the reason for this is because America is still too young of a country and doesn't have an identity. I can understand that argument. I may even agree to it to some degree. But I find that that argument is kind of weak because one of the interesting things that I think has been demonstrated since Charlottesville is this idea that it's not really that the statues are really something that are important to most Americans, that they're revered and remembered. It's because the statues now represent them. So it's not even, you know what I mean? It's not like comparing it to post-Soviet era, early 90s, and the statues of Stalin and Lenin that came down isn't an apples to apples comparison with what's happening in the US now,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
by the time those
Because you
statues
have
are
people
torn
who don't
down,
care about, Robert E. Lee and whatever other Confederate general and hero,
yeah, I mean,
right?
there were people
They
who lived
understand.
under Lenin and Stalin when those statues came down. There were people who were, born in the Soviet Union or hell, even in the Russian Empire or
Right.
Austria-Hungary, part of the Soviet Union. But again, point being is it was within a significant amount of the population's lifetime. Nobody alive today was around when Robert E. Lee was around.
That's right. That's right. And so there is that. I think we're trying to figure out like what is the significance of this because you know uh, it's kind of chilling to identify with these statues and to witness what has come about with these statues and to think about your future in the West and particularly in America. Um, and that was something I had thought about when Charlottesville was about to take place. I understood that as an argument emanating from the dissident right, from the alt right, whatever you want to call it, right? And I could understand why people would think that. However, I would say now that considering the other statues and monuments that have been defaced or brought down, for instance, the Shaw 54th Regiment statue in Boston, which was an all black regiment in the American Civil War, made famous by the movie Glory with Denzel Washington. That was defaced on the night of June the 3rd. You know, ACAB was written all over it. Like none of the depictions of these men are of like white men. They're all African American men. They are all black men, right? And then we have the one of Cervantes that was brought down, who was himself a slave for 5 years. What? is beginning to piece together actually is anything that looks like Western art, including the one with Christian Jagd, the Norwegian abolitionist who died in the Civil War fighting for the Union. That too was brought down.
Yeah, and Grant, Union General.
Yes. So in a way, anything that looks like Western art, that's how fundamental this is. So I would say that, it's kind of not like that. It's kind of not like the Soviet Union. And if we were forced to identify with Confederate statues 3 years ago, we are now identifying with anything that looks like Western art today. Period.
Yeah, I mean
Because
they
Western art is recognizable and separate and unique from all other arts, from all other representations. Not because it's unique to the West, but it's unique to all different cultural art forms. Chinese art looks like Chinese art, and there's very little that looks anything like it, right? That's what I'm getting at. Mayan art looks like Mayan art and doesn't have anything that looks like it. Well, yes, you could argue that the Aztec is a continuation of that. I get it. I understand it. I'm just painting a broad picture here, right? So I mean it in that sense. So Western art is recognizable, and that is one of the reasons why it's being destroyed. What we're seeing is basically is a request for an entire new civilization.
Oh, absolutely. That's actually a good way to look at it, and to take it even further, like they defaced an Armenian genocide memorial, which again had, I wouldn't call it Eastern, but a
This
distinct
is just
a
insane. I
distinct
cannot believe this. Go on, go on.
a distinct from Western style. But point being is, you have a point. They want something completely new. They want to start from square one, ground zero, whatever it may be. That
Yes,
anything that looks like what they were brought up, and anything that looks like the culture of the quote unquote oppressor, even if it's something honoring them or people who did great things for them, has to go. And again, you see this with the
yes,
rise of,
yes,
especially in Seattle, all these weird art displays or any weird art display, pretty much modern art, as it were. They want a complete overhaul, and again, they want fundamentally, and they've outright said this, they want something completely new. They view Western civilization as an oppressive force, like I said, even when it's working to their benefit, even when it's paying tribute to their heroes, such as again these abolitionists, or even in some cases actual black people. And
hmm
you know what case I'm waiting for?
What?
I'm waiting for them to deface or tear down something like the memorial to Judah P. Benjamin. Now, Judah P. Benjamin was the Secretary of War and Secretary of State of the Confederate States of America during the Civil War, and he was Jewish. If you couldn't guess by his name, but I'm waiting for them
Yes,
to go after a monument or a statue to some Jewish person, or possibly a Holocaust memorial, and I really want to see. Well,
or a synagogue.
yeah, like who is really the group that they're going to throw their weight behind in terms of this left wing coalition. Now, there was in London, some place in the UK, BLM was condemning the moves by the Israeli government to annex the West Bank, and they got called out for that. But point being is, I'm waiting for them to descend into this infighting. When do they attack something you like? When do they go after something you like? Because that's bound to happen, and it's it's strange because these groups constantly descend into infighting, but they're whipped back into shape the minute they need to be. And my question is, at least what I theorize, and I'll ask you, I'll ask our audience: is there any particular event that can break their coalition in the long term and not just short term infighting?
Uh, I don't think we can forget that. It's like a tap. Um, these groups can be controlled. The corporations can run out of the money when they want to. They can not make it a big story on CNN if they don't want to. You have the eerie feeling, whether you're watching CNN or BBC, France 24, and MSNBC, that they're all reading from the same script with minor differences. So they can make a lot of things a non-story. if they want to. They've done it before.
Yeah,
The
and even
question
with grassroots stuff on social media, I'm sure, as everyone in our audience knows, there's ways to make that disappear.
right, and it's very much the same thing when a Democrat is in office. I remember initially being very excited about Obama, and I remember sort of getting involved in reading more, and um, an American, an expat living in Canada, his wife was Canadian, um, asked me what did I think, and it was literally a month after he was signed into office, after the inauguration, and he asked me what did I think that Obama's presidency would bring, and I said. He'll stay either permanently in Iraq or Afghanistan. He'll start another war. He'll increase the amount of the debt, and he will also increase the amount of drone strikes. He was a liberal. Both his parents were professors. And I remember he was aghast, but he had nothing to say. What I should have also mentioned was that, and the media will find some way to spin this in a positive way, right? There was no peace movement during Obama's tenure, right? And this is what I'm getting at, right? Like, we know how this works, right? Socialists, I mean, so LARPing socialists, LARPing communists, and LARPing anarchists, and all these core groups, they only show up, to be anti-war when there's a Republican in office, and this is how it's going to work, I think, with race relations going forward, right? Because the whole point of the way things are happening right now is a threat. Like, if you're of European heritage, it's a threat. Like, we can make life really difficult for you if you don't voice the same opinions, if you don't I don't know, kneel at work, if you don't join the protests. So it's very subtle the way it works, right? Um, it's will we see protests if Biden gets elected? Yeah, probably, but they won't be at the same level. They won't get the same kind of coverage.
Yeah, it's
So
going to be
I think
like
that's
the Black
important
Lives
too.
Matter movement in the lead up to 2016. Well, and you're going to probably see in the case because they did this under Trump. If it happens outside of an election year, whether that be presidential or midterm, it's probably going to get swept under the rug. Now, of course, they play that up under Republican presidents, as you said. But imagine if in 2021 we're under the first year of President Biden. There's some racially charged incident. There's some incident that involves a white cop and a black man that ends badly for the black man. You'll hear some outrages about that, but I doubt there's going to be any mass movement about it because Joe Biden's in office and it's not an election year.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. And so that's why I say, there is a tap to this. They do have some control over it, right? I think one thing though that we should address is that despite whatever control they have over it, I think for most people from you know maybe May 31st to possibly June 1st or 2nd, I think lots of us realized that this was completely unprecedented, and that was only validated the weeks after that it continued. But I think most of us realized at that point that, the social fabric in America cannot come together again. It simply cannot. It went to such an excess. And yes, I know that, the LA riots saw more deaths, but it didn't spread beyond LA. We had 100 cities in the US with rioting, looting, and burning, and injuries, and even a few deaths. 22, not the 40 something of the LA riots. However, um, the you it was so ubiquitous across the entire country that I think that is really what has set the fear in, that there isn't a safe place.
Yeah, and what was the Republican response to that? Trump's campaign account tweeting about how Biden supported segregation in the 70s. That was the response to it. And of course, they also got Biden because, oh, he voted to reinstate Robert E. Lee citizenship or whatever else.
Yeah, it's just more pandering. And no matter how many times Trump panders to the left, it's unappreciated. Well, because he has original sin, and he did throw red meat, during the 2016 presidential election. So he'll never be forgiven for that. And all these, uh, previous sins of Biden, all of that can be forgiven. Quite frankly, we've seen that before. That all you have to do is join the Democrat Party or be in the Democrat Party and renounce your past. Like again, it's kind of like what I said earlier that the statues themselves represent Western art, even if the figures can be considered reprehensible or unnecessary. It doesn't matter because they're going to attack all of them because it's the civilization itself at stake. And they have it in their heads that the Republican Party is the party, however ineffectively, represents that past, represents the protection of that civilization, right? That's what angers them. And there is no forgiveness unless you become a Democrat, unless you leave office, unless that's it.
Yeah, that absolutely. And even if you are Mitt Romney, who will go out and say Black Lives Matter or finger wag and condemn Trump for his inflammatory comments, or whatever, they still hate Mitt Romney's guts. They still hate John McCain's guts when he died. Now, of course, they mourned him just to spite Trump. But no matter how many of these principled Republicans, and the newest one I've seen is the Lincoln Project, which is pretty much just more of the Bushite neoconservative Republicans saying we're the real conservatives and Trump is bad and Trump is a racist. I mean, they're still going to hate those people. You'll get some of the left wingers and the
Yes.
liberals who sign on saying, "Oh, look, bipartisanship, we're crossing the aisle." But how long will that last? Because within a day they'll be criticizing them. Oh, you support tax cuts, you Nazi. You want just simple border security. You don't even want a wall. That's like what Hitler did. You'll hear those sorts of things. That no matter how hard the
Mhm.
Republicans pander, it may buy them some time. It may buy them some favorability with these people. But at the end of the day, you might get redacted last. I'll say.
Right.
But there was one other thing I wanted to mention in that same vein. I've heard other people point this out that Trump has almost defanged the conservative movement in quite a way because people would cite things from 2014, 2015 during the original Black Lives Matter movement where you had figures like Ben Shapiro, like Sean Hannity, saying it should be considered a terrorist organization. These people, we need to bring down the full force of the law. Where under a Democratic president, under a Democratic administration, under a president, I would say more specifically that wasn't Trump, they were willing to take a more hardline stance. But ever since Trump came to office with his sort of rhetoric and what he, I guess, represents, even though I think it's a pretty loose term, but I think you all get the point, they don't want to be associated with Trump. They don't want to be associated with the far right. Whereas things that were normal conservative positions before, like that, like being tough on crime, law and order, all these various things. Oh yeah, law and order. If we tweet that in caps one more time, it'll work. Trust me, guys. But you have that sort of dynamic with them, and then you have this guy who's supposed to be this tough guy Republican really defanging that, which I think is one of the more interesting phenomena we've seen over the past few years.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Midas touch. What's happened is he's tainted the whole thing, and that's why they can't be associated with him. I mean, these are career politicians, right? What they want to do is be reelected and reelected. Like they literally want to be a poor actor who gets paid well forever until they die or until they can comfortably retire. We're not talking about great people. And I'm not saying this on behalf of Trump. Um, I'm just saying that's objectively true. They're cowards, and but they have. You could argue that they have a good excuse because um, Trump is a bad look. He's bad optics and so on, and their hands are tied, and that's where we are right now.
Absolutely, and again, I tend to go back to the point where what social fabric do we have? And people talk about this like we need to go out and stand up for ourselves, defend ourselves. Now, again, I'm going to tell you to do whatever you want. If you want to go to some counter demonstration, that's on you. I'm not advocating anything either way, but again, make your own choice is what I'm getting at. But point being is, I don't want to black pill, as they call it. I don't want to disparage you or send you into a feeling of despair, but I think with those particular actions, you're fighting a battle that is already lost, and that your energies could probably be better redirected into something else. Now, what that something else is, I'm not a thought leader, and I'm not trying to lead some political movement. I'm not going to tell you, but if you just want my advice on the current state of the country and the current state of culture and politics, trying to do any of these things we've done in the past is a lost cause.
Yeah, the demonstrations by and large did not work. Um, there were some good memes that came out of it. Some great footage. Shout out to the Proud Boys the last time they were in Seattle. But the truth is, uh, yeah, these counter demonstrations, I'm not so sure, and I'm not so sure that the FBI wouldn't have a plant in them either. Um,
I mean, just look at
but
that New
that's
Mexico
just
guy
me,
who shot somebody else in self defense. Now, his charges got dropped and everything, but they were ready to burn him at the stake for it.
right? And who's to say we had that young guy that went to um, please help me. I don't know whether it was in Texas or New Mexico, and he shot up like 20 people at a mall that was filled with like actual Mexicans from Mexico that were shopping there.
Yeah, that
You
was
know,
in Texas.
yeah, that was in Texas, and so these events do happen, right? Like, as a group, we're vilified because of this, and I would say going forward, there's an argument right now about whether to move to another state, to another town, to a different region of your state where it's safer. Uh, yeah, I would say do it. The counter argument to that, of course, is well, we're going to lose more ground. If we're going to greener pastures, we're going to lose more ground,
I'd
and
say
we're
it's
going to
happening
lose.
already. So I think the time to quote unquote regroup is now.
Yeah, yeah. I would say that um, you know the options are disappearing, right? And you have to think of your safety. You have to think of protecting yourself and your family, and you have to think about where to go to best do that, to best thrive. Um, um, you know, I would say emphatically, what these last 4 weeks have demonstrated is that we are going to have cities in the U.S. that are going to go to the level of criminality of the 70s. And everybody knows that I mean, it won't even be just whites leaving these cities. It'll be Asians. It'll be several different types of people who generally have good jobs, good income, who will be looking elsewhere where it will probably be safer. So it won't be simply just white Americans that are going to be doing this. But yeah, so I would argue that having looked at this argument from both points of view, that maybe moving to a place, if you can, that and you can make a go of it, you can make a living, yeah, do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like I said, at this point, I'm not saying all is lost. No, I think all is lost in terms of the old America, what you grew up America being portrayed as, what you were taught in the schools about the great constitutional republican system we have that upholds law and order and fairness and equality. Now, again, depending on your age, depends on what level of treatment you got to that. But I know the sort of education I had on the foundation of America and what American values are. That is undisputably dead, in my opinion. Now, am I saying all is lost? I'm saying you should just pick up and bail the entire country. Now, I think that's your own personal decision. I think that depends on your means and your connections outside this country, whatever. But at this point, I think you also have to look forward to. I wouldn't call it a post-American future, but to a new America. And if you get lucky, you'll have a part in at least helping shape that. Look, I'm going to tell you this: the odds are against you. It's going to be an uphill battle, metaphorically, of course. I'm not implying it's going to be an actual battle for anyone out there dumb enough to take it in that context. But point being is, if you stick around, if you regroup with like-minded people, I'm not suggesting you form Waco compounds or anything. But point being is, if you do any of this, you may be able to help forge something new. And as much as I hate to say it, you may have to let go of some of these concepts that you held near and dear in the past that you might still hold in high regard, like a lot of the quote unquote constitutional values, which, again, arguably defanged us in many ways compared to some of the other political theories at the time and the Articles of Confederation. But point being is, you there's no point in looking back right now. You have to look forward for better or for worse.
Right. You can't save it. It's done. I think, probably many Americans are having fears right now about um, maybe new gun laws and whatnot. But um, the truth is, so many guns have been bought already that I don't know how they can really roll it back in an effective way. People will just not dump them. They will find a way to hold on to them.
Yeah, look at the
It's
pathetic
the
turnout for the
situation is
bump
just
stock
too
laws.
dire. It's
Like,
just what people witnessed was too scary. So I don't think they're going to just comply. And that brings us to another point: is where is America going to go in the future? Is it going to balkanize? Is it going to have some junta? Is it how is it going to be run? I personally don't see how it can be run in a coherent way uh,
wait, are you telling me we're
going
not going to get
forward.
snow? Are you telling me we're not going to get snowy Brazil?
Well, I mean, no, not necessarily.
Sorry,
I'm kind of saying,
I had to.
uh, like I think many people are wondering how long can this go on. Um, I don't see any kind of ideology. I don't see any kind of workaround method that is somehow going to reunify the United States or the West, for that matter. Um, it's not there because this is plain and simple about different groups who want different things, and um, it's going to cost one group in order to get that. So I don't see that happening, no matter how. Because of course it's also tied into this global capitalism that we have going, and you know maybe global capitalism will arrive at a point where, with regard to minorities, that their whatever little identities that they have at the moment are fine as long as they're plugged into the system. And so, this kind of revamping, this new America, this new slate of America is really for them, and nothing of the old America can ever reoccur. So I personally, I don't know if America will balkanize. I think there's a distinct possibility of that. I think we're going to know by 2040 for sure, because by then we will be a minority.
Yeah, like barring some drastic change, which again it would take a lot. It's heading in that direction now. Whether balkanization or just being a banana republic sort of system is the future. Again, time will tell with that, and I do agree. And they're really trying to snuff out the last bit of old America, as it were. Even some of the more undesirable elements that I wouldn't like. Even again, a lot of the statues that they're tearing down, believe me, are people that I do not have a very high opinion of. That I've never really had a very high opinion of. But again, it comes down to the point. It's like they're not tearing down. They're not renaming. Woodrow Wilson Center because they hate him for the central banks in World War One. They're doing it because he was an American president before 2020. That's why they're doing it. So any of
Right.
these things. But my ultimate point is like, yeah, they're going to try to snuff it out. It's going to be an uphill battle metaphorically, and God forbid, I hope none of you have to come in the situation where you might actually have to defend yourselves. One good thing is the abundance of firearms, at the point where any disarmament of the American population or any attempt at a buyback would spectacularly fail, as we saw with the bump stock bans, I don't know, about 2 years ago now. So there are things like that, but again, the point I'm going to press home is no matter what's happening, whether you're in the darkest pit or think you're on top of the world, you always have to be looking to the future. You always have to think what comes next. How do I respond to situations X, Y, or Z? You need to be thinking about these things. Now, that's not only like as a broad political thing, but in your personal life. Now, again, how much you'll have to worry about the future and what you'll have to worry about applies again to your particular individual situation. But at the end of the day, even if we somehow come out on top of this, do not get complacent. Even if you're at the bottom of it, do not get complacent. Don't resign yourself to whatever humiliating fate they have. Now, again, I know I'm bordering on Fed posting, and yeah, I try to avoid that. But again, I'm going to repeat myself and just summarize it like this: regardless of what's happened in the past, for good and for ill, whatever you're losing, whatever you're gaining, don't look back, look forward.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And I think also, maybe if we could just quickly touch upon Canada, whose birthday it was this Wednesday.
You see, I
Um,
would have wished you a happy Canada Day, but then I realized I do not speak French, Punjabi, or Mandarin. Now, to be fair, I doubt you speak much Spanish or Ebonics, so you can't really send me my wishes for the fourth. But I suppose we'll have to call it even.
yeah, I mean, I can read some French and kind of understand it from school, but um, speaking it is quite another thing. But I think sometimes people wonder, like, well, what about the Canadians? Or what about the Canadian situation? And I think one of the things that's relevant is just how many Canadians are actually have been involved, with the, let's say, the uh, light right, the alt right, the dissident right, the NRX crowd, the Tradcaf crowd. There are a lot of Canadians, and I think one of the reasons there are is because America is looked at as the pivotal uh, point of struggle
Yeah, and I
uh,
would say to
for,
continue on
for
that,
the entire West.
I think Canada is a petri dish of America. I think all the stuff that eventually comes to America is tested in a controlled environment up in Canada.
It is, but I don't think the results are going to be the same.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's
I'll
the
give you the
thing. But
reason.
yeah, but continue,
Yeah,
continue.
yeah. Like, for instance, in Canada, there is no right wing movement to even speak of. There's no nationalist movement to speak of. There aren't even any groups that some would deem crazy that are a constant threat and a challenge to the government. So none of that exists. We are the fastest demographically changing country in the world at the moment. That could change in a year or two, but we will still be in the top five no matter what. So in a way, in Canada, there is actually no resistance to it. I presume everything will just happen more quietly. The other is, it's generally speaking, it's a less lawless society. There is less violence, but as the numbers grow, that has changed. Toronto and other major Canadian cities, the violence is very, very different than it was even just 2 decades ago. So there's a considerable uptick, and almost all of this is gang related. Um, so I think the kind of changes that are moving along everywhere in the West, they're happening here, but they're just happening in a quieter way, and we don't have any kind of politician that can resist this, and we don't have any kind of movement that has any kind of staying power or weight to it that can push back. Uh, so it's kind of a depressing scenario, and I think that's why you have a lot of Canadians involved with the dissident right in America, because it's the only place where you can kind of fight it, because you know that much of what happens to Canada depends on what happens in the States, and that's not just economic, but that's cultural as well.
So what you're telling me is the Aussies are the most resilient Anglospherians.
Yes, unironically, yes.
I mean, honestly, when I look at the Anglosphere in terms of countries in their current form or their historical form, out of all of them, the only one I can see surviving into the next 50 years, relatively recognizable to what it once was, is Australia.
Yeah, perhaps. Although they had a gun confiscation, but it's hard to tell.
Yeah,
It's
but
hard to
I mean,
tell.
I would say immigration wise, they're probably the best off out of all the ones in that regard. But
Hmm.
uh, yeah, it is interesting that I suppose we can all be refugees to Australia and rebuild rebuild America there. the, the outback Americans or
Yeah,
American outbackers. I don't know. Outback Americans, probably they come over here. But again, I think you all get where I'm going with this. But
I do.
oh yeah, I mean Canada, it is sort of hitched to America for better and for worse. They socially tend to be ahead when it comes to the insanity, but it plays out differently. And the point you made, actually, why you had so many Canadian figures involved in these weird political movements, is the fact that, well, why not go to the heart of the empire and influence there and wait for it to ripple to our country? Because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
that's how it works. And you see that attitude in a lot of places around the world. I see a lot of Europeans who talk about American politics. I see a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of, but a significant amount of Australians talk about European politics. Pretty much Anglosphere politics in particular, and Western politics, just in a even broader view, hinges on what happens in America geopolitically, what happens in America culturally, what happens in America economically. So, whatever happens here, whether that be we by some miracle win or we get pushed into snow Brazil territory or somewhere in between, which I think is probably the more likely solution. I don't see balkanization on the table with the current set of facts we have right now, but I mean, we've all seen how things rapidly change. Nobody would have thought the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse 6 years before it collapsed, or nobody would have thought the British Empire was on the brink of collapse at the end of World War II. I mean, there were signs, there were things that pointed to it, but again, they were probably feeling like us, like, well, yeah, it could happen, but it's not that bad, no, is it? So it's hard to gauge
Well,
those
I
kind
mean,
of things. But at the end of the day, there's so much focus on the United States because whatever happens here is going to ripple out into not only the Anglosphere at large, but the Western world at large, and by extension, the entire world. I mean, you want to talk economically, maybe not so much culturally. Look at East Asia; they're going to be affected by any sort of crisis in America. But I think the point stands.
yeah. I mean, I would argue that white Americans are going to be less invested in America going forward, anyways. They'll they will become like many other minorities. They will be invested in themselves as a group. I think that trend is going to continue
Oh yeah, I
as
mean, I
the
already see a massive, like with the statue tearing down, a massive resurgence in sort of the Southern identity thing with the Confederate flags and talking about how the War of Northern. I mean, again, going back to the what defines them as Southerners rather than what defines them as Americans, and I see that with a lot of white ethnic groups identifying more with their home countries' ethnicities. Like where I live, there's quite a few Eastern Europeans, and not that they haven't ever been disconnected from their heritage, but it seems like over the years they've been identifying more with it. I noticed in my own personal life, even as just a LARP, I've been identifying more and more as an American of Italian descent. And I know you've laid out that you've really reconnected with your Slavic identity over the past however many years. So you are seeing that.
yeah, and I mean I saw the inklings of this way back in the 90s, but it's it's really going to take off. But I was talking more in particular of heritage Americans, Americans who've been here for
Yeah, like
multiple
founding
generations.
stock WASP Americans, like the people whose ancestors fought in the Revolution, that kind of stuff. But Yeah,
right, them, but also I would say other people of European heritage who came well after that and whose backgrounds are, a mix of several different kinds of Europeans, um, who've known nothing else other than, the America that let's say the America of the last 60, 70 years, right, at the very least.
yeah, the
So,
America that won World War II and
those
controlled the
Americans
world.
are I think they're less invested in this new America. And in fact, in many ways, this new America doesn't want them invested in it because there's no room for their voice. And so, in a way, like this is another iteration of global capital America. You know, it's perhaps the final iteration of that. No, it's a post-nationalist nation, kind of the way Canada has become. Um, I mean, I know Canadians. I have two Canadian friends who literally want to move to a red state, just to that adamantly want, and who have deep connections with Americans already established. Um, that's going to be an interesting thing going forward because I don't know where this ends. I don't know. Like we're not going to go back to prior to 2020. That's never going to happen. So it'll be interesting to see, maybe what a small number of Canadians do because they find their situation in Canada more hopeless than if they were Americans.
Yeah, and that might actually create an interesting dynamic if you see uh, dissidents from Canada start to come to Red America and assert themselves as allies of this more conservative, more right wing, more, let's say, in general, white sort of American identity. Because I I think that would generally be a positive because they are like-minded people from again another WASP culture, another former British possession. There's a lot of shared histories what I'm getting at, and
Mhm.
it I don't know, it could be a buoy to the right wing if some of them did now. But again, in Canada especially, you get a lot of the dumb white liberals, sort of the California types who would pick
Yeah,
up and bail, but then bring their horrible views and their dumb opinions with them and ruin where they go next. Like again, the California effect into Colorado, into Texas, into Arizona. You've seen it before. It's not just the Hispanic
yeah,
immigration, which believe me, Hispanic immigration is a big part of why these states are flipping. But it is the a middle class white, upper middle class white liberals who think they're
live
right
in
about everything in the
suburbs.
world. Yeah, yeah, those
Yes.
sort of people. But so that could create an interesting dynamic going forward into the future. But yeah, we're in for some interesting times to say the least. Look, there'll be plenty of bad things that happen, but perhaps it's just the eternal optimist in me. There'll be plenty of opportunities for us as well. Now, whether that be here, abroad, or whatever, or someplace halfway across the country, you don't know where things are going to end up. I mean, again, the example I go back to is no great empire foresaw its own collapse until it was upon, like, until they were on the eve of it. So, and again, a lot
And
of
the, and the level of investment, again, by Europeans and by minorities is not really that great. People are not terribly invested into this place. If they are, it's because of their single issue about their people, but they're not invested in it in a kind of a grand vision of what this place is.
yeah, absolutely. And well, you have anything else?
No, that's about it. I was going to go on about are we going to see another Chopper Chaz? But I don't know, considering how how cringe the last one is. It'll probably be a while before that happens.
Yeah, and I have a feeling there's probably going to be more with the disease outbreak, with numbers spiking because of the protests and everything. Things are probably going to go back into a more, I would say, hibernation state with a lot of people staying home even if they aren't ordered to by the state and a lot of things shutting down again. So I do think we might actually be in for a reprieve come the fall because again, I don't see with the numbers I'm looking at now. how they don't do what they did in the winter and spring. But I could be wrong. Time will tell.
Yeah, it's always hard to gauge. October, I think, is going to ramp. Personally, I think October it will get ramped up again. I can't see the Democrats not protesting. So,
Yeah,
or even Republicans rallying around Trump. I can't see an entire October without activity.
yeah. What we need those good old October surprises. They're an American tradition, and that's keep in mind 3 months off. Believe it or not, and it's July already. You'll be
Mhm.
listening to this on the 4th of July. So yeah, I'm just saying, keep your eyes peeled, stay safe, and don't do anything stupid. That's my ultimate advice to you. I'm
Yeah,
leaving you. So
stay a lifeguard. Yep.
yeah, and tune into the War Report here on my YouTube channel. Above all, so thank you everyone for tuning in,
That's it.
and goodbye.
Take care.